Hi, everybody. Welcome to our third day of Culturama in our first weekend, and I'm just thrilled because we got a great poet today, named of Michaelsun Knapp. He is a Mount SAC graduate. He's also a graduate of IAIA, and this is the first in a couple of things he's doing. He'll also be telling us what native poets we should be reading. That'll be in the evening in an upcoming uh, uh, weekend. So, Michaelson, take it away.
Hi, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me, John. So this is an exercise that I've worked through with and came through at IIA, Institute of American Indian Arts, that I came to because I'm slowly losing my hearing, but I have a deep love for lyricism, um, and so I figured out. Um, a way to sort of cheat at lyricism. And so I want to thank CNC Machine for letting me, I didn't ask them, for stealing the title from them, just let the music take control. Um, and this exercise will do a couple of things with letting the music take control and cheating at lyricism. And one of those is to, right, like the first subtitle says, right, we can build lyricism into the bones of the poem, right? And so which makes it a lot easier to in revision and editing processes, right? Be able to maintain that lyrical quality, and to do that intentionally rather than to sort of have it accidentally or to um, uh, be sort of magically born with an ear for it, right? Or to develop an ear for it. When I say cheating at lyricism, right, it's a rather developing an eye for it, right, rather than an ear for it. Um, and I am not a super technology person, so if you'll all forgive any sort of future hiccups that may come along the lines here. Um, so this is something that I'm going to have sort of all of us do. So if you get a hold of paper or just alt tab over into a Word document or notes document, whatever you want to do. Um,
I
so
can
I'm
I
gonna,
can put it up on our website after if you like.
yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah. Um, oh, there we go. So when we talk about lyric and lyricism, right, what does that, what does it mean for something to be lyrical, embrace the lyric, utilize lyricism, right? It means that it pays clear attention to sound, right? And we can see that the poet is doing that, right? That's an intentional thing. And poetry is not the only genre where lyricism is utilized, right? Famously, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Sylvia Plath use lyricism in their fiction, right? Right? The Great Gatsby has entire paragraphs, right, that are just in wonderful metrical prose. But it's also finding a home in contemporary sci-fi and fantasy writing. Right? We're seeing more and more of that coming in, especially in short fiction and in some of those middle and top tier magazines. Um, right? Right, and so often it's when clear attention is paid by the poet to sound in their words. And this is one of those things where it's going to come up at repetition. Right? This is if poetry has any right singular tool that it's going to use more and more often, right? It's going to be repetition, and that's right the creation and breaking of patterns, right? And people are really adept at finding patterns. We're so good at finding them that we can even find patterns where there are no patterns, right? And we see that today, sort of right with some of these conspiracy theories, right? Identifying patterns where there are no patterns, right? Um, right. So what does it mean to pay attention to sound? Right. When we pay attention to sound in poetry, right, we're generally talking about repetition of sound, and most commonly we understand this through rhyme, right? Right, and most commonly we see where we see rhyme or where we've encountered rhyme in the past, right? Is generally right perfect rhymes at the end of a line, right? And so here's an example from The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. Right, I tried to get away, but I couldn't get far because a man with a tow truck repossessed my car. Right, and so you can see sort of the highlighted far and car. Right, this is somewhat what we're used to, right? But lyricism is so much more, and we see this with just a little bit of time, right, in the right in the development of hip hop, right, with the Notorious B.I.G., right, or Biggie Smalls, in his song "Hypnotize," right, Papa been smooth since days of under ruse, never lose, never choose to bruise crews who do something to us, talk go through us, right? And so we could see, right, where much more of these sounds are happening, right, in both within the line, right, but he's also in terms of what he's doing with where the sentence and the line breaks, right? He's moving that, right? He's playing more with that line break as well, which gives him a lot more fluidity and a lot more options, both metrically and content wise. Um, to explore and to make room for that lyric and for that lyricism. And I'm going to investigate this a little bit more here. Right. So how Biggie do, right? So we could see a few things, right? And part of why I want to go through all of this is to give us a little bit of an understanding and to open up some freedom within ourselves to let these rhymes and these sounds happen, right? Not just at the end of the word, right? But within the center of the word, at the beginning of the word, right? And rhyming, right? They don't just have to be the middle of the word rhyming with the middle of the word, right? We can have this happen, right? Like when we see here, right? Papa repeats sound, right? Biggie repeats sounds found all over the place, right? Not just at the end of the word, right? When we look in the mid at that first line, right? Papa been smooth since days of under ruse, right? He's rhyming the middle of a word with the end of another word, right? Within the same line, right? This is something that's available to us, right? And something that we can start to pay attention to when we know we want to start to pay attention to it, right? We also see Biggie playing with sounds that differed with region-specific pronunciation, right, as opposed to how like the king, right, the Queen's English would say, right. So when you just look at Papa Ben Smooth since days of under ruse, right, can see that he pronounces Ben the same way that I tend to, right, which is bin, the bin sound, right, and so the in sound in bin, right, rhyming with the in sound in since, right. um, and he'll utilize words that are usually ignored for their lyric quality, right? Things like and again, these are things that we can borrow from Biggie, right? The O sound in Papa is the same sound that we see in the word of, right? And so we can right utilize right those prepositions and articles, pronouns, and things like that, right? Those aren't just throwaway words or words that just get us to the next content word, right? We can make use of those, right? They can fit in with the lyric, right? They can become words of function, right? As we allow the lyric to have that function, right? And again, right? So like Biggie will take a clause over the line break, which when if we go back, if we recall, right, right, the previous example, right, I tried to get far, but a guy towed away my car, right. We could hear right how the clause and the end of the line break, right, are the same thing, right. Um, right, and he'll also make use of slant rhymes, which are words that have similar sounds, but whose sounds aren't exactly the same, right. And there's been definitions for slant rhyme throughout the centuries, right? As that sort of there's a traditional slant rhyme, there's more contemporary slant rhymes, but I'm not going to get into a whole lot of the technical parts of this. There's absolutely a benefit of having right that technical knowledge, but what I'd rather spend our time doing is sort of writing and playing with sound. So we're going to do how Richard Hugo says to do, right? And that's if you make a sound you like, make it again, right? And that's sort of going to be part of how we get this to work, right? Um, so let's get it started in Ha, right? And the idea, right, is we're going to build lyricism into the bones, right, into the fibers and marrow of a poem, right? So how we're going to start doing that, I'm going to sort of, again, I am really serious when I talk about cheating at lyricism. I'm going to sort of guide you into this a little bit sideways. Um, so if you're going to follow along, And with the exercise, I'd like you to write down just 10 words that you like. They don't need to be in English, right? Um, and right? And just words that you enjoy, just words that you like. Um, and once you have those 10 words, what I want you to do is then break them up into their sounds, right? And that only, however you define that, is up to you, right? This is right. You're going to break it into the sounds that you like, right? Excuse me, right? Right. Whether that's syllables or phonemes doesn't matter, right? Um, and if you've never heard of a phoneme, it's not important. Right? Um, right? And then just spell those sounds out in a way that makes sense to you. Right? You're the only one who's going to see this. You're the only one this matters to. Right? And give us a few minutes here. So my phone says it's 1:20. We'll go ahead and move on to the next thing. And I'll be sending this to John, and John will put it up on the thingy. So if you're like me and you have slow handwriting, you can sort of come back through some of these things as you need to. So as we get close here, here's an example of my 10 words, right? And I've broken them into their sounds. Widdershin, which is my favorite definition of, which is my favorite word for counterclockwise. Render, meld, which is a French word. Scorpion, chocolate, halcyon, lagoon, murmuration, décolletage, which is another French word, and nemesis. Murmuration is probably one of my favorite words on here. It's just it's a beautiful word with a to describe a beautiful thing. It's a word to describe the movement of starlings. It's that sort of, right, as starlings move as a huge group, right? That's referred, right, and make those beautiful shapes in the sky. If you've ever been able to see that, it's referred to. It's the a murmuration. Right? That's what they're doing from scientific standpoint. Right? As poets, we can call it whatever we want. Right? It's the power of the symbol. So once you have those sounds broken up, I want you to pick 7 sounds that are consonant driven and 3 that are vowel driven. right? And so as you can see on here, vowel driven, meaning that, right, right, they begin right, with these vowel sounds, right? Um, right, the E sound in scorpion, or at least the way that I pronounce scorpion, I like that E sound from there. The sound in murmuration, as well as that A sound near the end. And then I've picked some words from some of these other ones. Excuse me. So, and I just, try to pick diverse sounds, right? Ones that sound different from each other. So long as you pick ones that uh, sound different from each other, you're going to be okay. I'm going to go ahead and move on. So now I want you to start to arrange those, right, at least separate them off to the side, so you can look at them, because what we're gonna do now is make words out of these sounds, right? And they by no means have to be perfect, right? Right. If the sounds remind you of another word, that's perfect, right? Again, this is cheating at lyricism, right? And we're gonna have, right, um, those sounds, right, and the cousins of those sounds, right? These are all going to be in here, right? So this is one, right? So what I have up here is one way um, to organize the sounds so that you can look at them in different ways, right? You can start with a consonant sounds and move to the right, looking across, right? So one of the words that I could have, right, right, the consonant sound, right, that I have in shin, right, and a vowel sound to e, right, could get me to shiny, right. So that can be a word, right. But I can see that as I look just straight across. I don't know if you can see my mouse at all, right, but shiny, right. But you can also, right, uh, start with a vowel sound and move into a consonant, right? Right. So udder, right? You're looking at udder, under, right? A lot of these, right? It's not perfect, right? But it's perfect enough for us, right? Um, right? Because again, we can go slant if we want. Right? Um, and so what I want you to do is start putting together some words, right? Aim to get about 10 to 15, but if you can get more, the more the merrier. Um, and here's some examples of sort of how I put together um, some of my words, how I got to them. Um, and there's, right, as long as those, right, uh, right, as long as you're in a starting place from those sounds, um, you're going to be in a good spot, right? Um, and this is probably what takes the longest with this exercise, right? Is coming up with these words. Right? Building new words out of the, right, out of the right, out of the hand-picked sounds of old words. Right? But what it does is it's going to limit um, the sounds that the sounds that we'll use, right? And we'll see those sounds repeating throughout these words. So for this, we'll wait until my phone says it's 1:30, which is about 4 or 5 minutes from now. Give us all some time to make our words. I'm gonna mute myself so I quit burping into the microphone. And you're more than welcome to steal from me, from this, right? You want to steal my sounds, you want to steal some of these words, go for it. All right, so we're coming in on 1:30 here. Do we need some more time, or are we're pretty okay? You have to unmute yourself, or I'm gonna go with Woodrow Wilson rules, right? If you don't say anything, it means yes. Yeah, yeah. It's a reference from 19. Is there a way I can, if I get to this, I can see a few more. So do we need more time? We're doing okay. Just trying to glance through the. Okay. So I'm not seeing anybody who's saying we need more time. So we go with Woodrow Wilson rules. Okay. So now we're going to take the words that we've made, and we're going to put those words in a order, right? And you're going to give yourself about 6 lines Um, and again, you can go less, you can go more, but try to stick to around 6. Make sure you have at least one of these words that you've created per line, right? Try to use as many of them as you can, but you don't have to use all of them. You can repeat words, you can, twice, 3 times, right? As many times as feels right. And don't worry about making sense yet, right? We're gonna let the music take control, right? Just put them in an order that sounds good, right? That feels good, right? If you were able to get a few pronouns, articles, prepositions, hold off on those. Hold off on adding those to your list. Right? They're going to be they're going to be useful to us in a moment. Give us about a minute to do that. Okay. And then, right, so here's what my uh, right, what my list looks like. Right? So put some space in between them. Right. Again, none of this is written in stone. Right? So as we move from here, right, if you feel that you need to move something around, if you need to switch a word out, right, we can do whatever we need to. Right? But don't worry about making sense just yet. Just get words on the page. So I'm gonna keep moving here. Um, and, so now the music has been in control for long enough, right? So we're gonna start letting the sense begin, right? So what I want you to do is go word by word, and you're gonna add words between them to try to make sense, right? But I want you to use as few words as possible between the words in your list, right? And this is where um, the articles, pronouns, prepositions, if you had any of those from your list, right? This is where they're going to come back in, right? And you're going to bring these back in as you need them, right? But this is where they're going to be incredibly useful. Right? And again, as you're going through to make a kind of sense, um, right? And allow yourself to be surprising, right? Right. But if you need to switch a word out, go for it. Right? If you need to move stuff around, go for it. Right? Um, there's some fun psychology going on in here, or at least it's a little bit interesting to me. We'll talk about it a little bit later. And so here's what I have, and I've highlighted the words that were on my list. Right? Um, Yeah. You can see it, um, uh, right? For example, like cinder, right? Um, I turned it into a verb, right? Put it in the past tense, right? We have cindered, right? And I put this together just going, word at a time. What's the fewest amount of words I can put to make sense, just word to word, right? And move just through the lines. And you can see that I moved some things around, switched a word out or two here and there. One of the things we can see with this, as you're going through this, is those sounds that you created, right? Those sounds that you took, those are all sounds that you like, and so they made new words, right, out of those sounds, right? We put them back into new words, right? And this is all built on things that we like, right? And as we go to make sense of those things that we like, we're going to be talking about things that we're interested in, right? And again, meaning is highly subjective, right? But in terms of what we see in the poem that we wrote, right, we can start to see, right, this is an exercise that can do a lot of things. One of the things it can do is help us to get through um, some blocks, right? Help us to open up some new areas of content for ourselves, right? Um, right? One of the things that I see in this poem that right that I got out of this, right, is a conversation about um, right, about homelessness, um, about right how we do and don't help each other, um, right, and right, and in a way that right, I feel should change, or right, like there's something critical in here um, of that conversation, and that's not something that I've written about at all. Right, my content tends to stay in these other sort of areas that I visit and revisit and visit and revisit. Um, but there's something in here too, right? And that's not something that I would have necessarily um, maybe thought to write a poem about, unless right there was some kind of right some sort of triggering event that I encountered, right, outside of my usual life, right, and the events that I encounter there, right. But it is still something that I think about and have feelings about, uh, and and can still right realize right like I maybe need to right uh, divert some energy and time into this, right? This is something that right, when I went to make sense, right, this is the sense that was made, um, and when we get some interesting right. So I don't know about interesting, right? I'm going to toot my own horn, right? But some somewhat surprising um, images, right? A cola-colored ocean, right? Um, which I didn't want to just be right water, and I didn't want it to actually be soda, right? And so I added right that we breathe, right? And all of a sudden, right, that becomes the air, right? It starts right. There's a conversation about pollution that's happening, right? Um, right. And so that's some of the interesting psychology that comes behind this as we let music take control, right? It's sort of it acts right. It slips a little bit past, um, right. It dips a little bit into the unconscious and grabs things that we're the things that we care about, things that we're interested in, but not necessarily things that will always right, necessarily write poems about. And we don't, right, right, I think about the Dene poet, Orlando White, who in his life is very interested and very politically driven, especially um, concerning, right, like Israel and things like that. That's one of the areas that he's very focused around. Um, but that doesn't show up. That's not something that he necessarily writes poems about, right? What he writes poems about, um, he writes these wonderful meditations on individual letters, right? And the way that letters interact with each other, right? Poetically, he's very interested in people like B.P. Nichols and things like this, right? Um, and one of the things this does is help us to look at some of these other areas that, right, we might find right, not political, but poetical content to write about, but also, right, helping us to build into our poem, right, this strong lyric, right? If we look at, right, when we limit ourselves to these sounds, we're going to right, we're going to have to repeat those sounds, right? And as we repeat those sounds, right, 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 if we make a sound we like, right, we're going to make it again. We're going to follow that Richard Hugo advice, right? And so in that way, right, the lyric is built into the bones of this poem, right? As if we go through and start to edit, right, um, right, we're going to want to keep some of those sounds in mind as we edit and revise, right? But even if we don't, right, if we have to add words that use different sounds, right, we're still going to have these strong bones of lyricism in here. It's going to be really hard to take the lyric out of this poem, right? Um, whereas when you start to build poems without that in mind, right, it can be really difficult to edit with lyric, right? To edit for the lyric, right? To put the lyric into a poem that didn't necessarily have it, um, right, as deeply as this, as creating poems in this way, or at least with this, right, with this in mind, right. It can be a lot harder to do that, and I say that having done it, right, for in a poem that's like 30 some pages long that didn't have um, lyric in it, right? Went through and added lyric, which helped to make it strong. It helps to bind some of these poems, right? We can bind them not just with sense but with sound, right? This is part of how we look at the poem "The Jabberwocky," right? Um, which I think is a great poem that's illustrative of so many things. Um, chief among which is a conversation about sense, right? Things making sense and sound, right? There's so many things in that poem that are just made up, right? We don't know what they are, right? And we don't need to know what they are, right? And so we add that conversation and talking about poems where there are real words that we just don't know, right? Um, right? We can still get a lot out of that poem, right? We can still get, right? Like there is no jub jub tree, right? Right. What is a frumious bandersnatch? Is it a bandersnatch that is currently feeling frumious, or is it, right, sort of like a bald eagle, right? Like it, right? The eagle is not bald, right? But right, bald is what just, right, how we understand, right, differentiate that bird from another, right? That eagle from another eagle, right? Is that what a frumious bandersnatch is? We have no idea, but these are words and right, things that make up these huge parts of it. But what really holds that poem together, right? We've got a little bit of sense, right? There's right? Son goes out and does a thing, comes back, his dad is stoked, right? Um, there's just a tiny bit in that poem, but what attracts us to that poem is not the sense, right? What attracts us to that poem are the sounds, right? And the soundscape is what holds that poem together. And so now you've got a really great way to help to put together poems, right? To help you build poems into the lyric, and you can use this to, right, as a way to, right, take apart your own poems and, right, as a revision process to build lyric into it, right? And to get at, right, if you're feeling blocked, you don't know what to write about, right? You can, right, let the music take control, right? Give yourself a couple of sounds, build some words, put those words in an order, see what that order brings you to. So, can I take any questions or anything of that nature? I don't know how to, let me, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so I can see all of our beautiful faces.
Yeah, people can also drop in questions in the chat room too.
I can. I've got chat open so I can see it now.
Okay. This is so cool. What might be some next steps to working with what we have written?
Yeah, so one of the editing processes we can do is, right, the same way that we took those words, right, the list of words, and broke them into sounds, right? We can start to do that with things that we've already written, right? Not necessarily taking apart, and we can do that, right, by sight, not necessarily only by ear, right? Look at just, right, looking at letters, right, and letter combinations that we see repeated throughout a poem, and even just taking a highlighter, right, and going through, right, and this can be where I think there's a way to use a thesaurus that's right for poetry and that's wrong for poetry. I think the right way of using a thesaurus is to remind us of the words we already know, right? A thesaurus, I think, is a bad way for a poet to learn new words, right? Because they aren't words that we have sort of right embodied, right? They aren't words that we're right, that we encounter um, right in reading or in life, right? And that can be how we can, and it can be fun, amusing mistakes, but that's how we can, right, dive into a billiard, right, instead of diving into right, a pool of water, right, even though they're both pool, right. um, right, so having to have that dictionary open as well to make sure that we're using the words, right, in a way that means what they do mean, right. um, right, and so that would be where I would say, right, when a good editing process, and then, right, looking for those words that have those sounds in them, right. How can we find, right, um, right, how can I switch out some of these other words for words that have these sounds, right, um, right, and limiting yourself to those just a few vowel sounds, because those vowel sounds will help to hold, right, these huge areas together with that sound, right, and allowing those, right, those consonant sounds to sort of speckle like stars a little bit, right, continuing to sort of hold, right, hold lines together and things like that. um, right. Get a villanelle. Yeah, villanelles, I have thoughts about villanelles. I love villanelles, but I think there's, in English, a similar problem with the right, because English has so many end sounds, and the villanelle is a French form, right? And French, like Italian, have so few end sounds, right? that I think one of the fun things to do with a villanelle is to do uh, what sort of following what Shakespeare did with the Petrarchan sonnet, right? Right, find a similar way to do that with the villanelle, right? Right, where how do you right with the Petrarchan sonnet is a sonnet that only has A and B end sounds, right? Uh, right, and Shakespeare takes that to all the way down to G, right? So it just adds a ton more, right? But he still keeps right some of these other elements of the sonnet uh, that are right that help to make it a sonnet, right? Um, which at this point, right, is just 14 lines, right? If we look at right like American sonnets, right? Right, there's right Terence Hayes, right, is one of our great sonneteers of the 21st century, right, with American sonnets for my past and future assassin, right? Um, right. Um, but right with villanelles, right? How do you keep that in there with right, by adding more rhyme, right? By both with adding more end sounds to it, I think helps to make the villanelle more plausible in English. Right? When you look at a lot of contemporary villanelles, a lot of them have to cheat, right? Um, and again, with this, right, like I don't have any problem with cheating, um, right? But right, um, I think we can rebuild a villanelle that makes where it'll make better sense to be for writing it in English. Right? Instead of the end rhyme, I just repeated these words in which they're sonically linked. Yeah, right. Um, Cats are just tearing through the house. We have wood floors, so they're just not making all of those turns uh, down hallways. Um, Super great. Right? Can we use this technique to develop a revision process? Absolutely, absolutely. Right. I talked a little bit earlier about a revision process that I use. Right. Um, for sound, and part of what can be helpful is knowing right but in paying attention to right the sonic field, knowing what sounds you're making and what sounds you're not making, right? And so that you can create um an area of surprising sound, right, where you can have these right um I have a poem that I did this revision process for, and I did as much as I could to remove um, all of the sounds in the word dead, so that when eventually right, the person in the poem does die, and I say that they've died, right? Right, we get the news that they're dead, right? Um, it's sonically surprising because those sounds are not they're present, right? Because it's really hard to write poems um, without those sounds, but right, they're so reduced that right, so that when those sounds come out in that order, right, um, it has that surprise, right, um, and it catches you the way that it caught us when this person died in our lives, right? Um, can we use absence of sound in our poems as well? Absolutely, absolutely, right. Um, there's um, there's a great essay um, about poetry writing. Um, oh, he's one of the Black Mountain poets. Um, Stephanie might be able to help me with this. He's friends with Robert Creeley. Um, his last name starts with an O. Snyder. No, it's not Snyder. I want to say it's like George O something. Anyways, he has this great essay um, about um, about like how you should read your poems. Um, and in that, I think it's called projected verse. It's called projected verse, and he's talking about that, right? Um, but one of the right, and often it's used to as an influence to right what like how you should read your poems. But you can use this essay right in terms of like being very loud, um, right? Um, but I've also right, but I talked about Orlando White before. When you see Orlando read and when you read his work, uh, Charles Olson, thank you. Um, and so when you see him, when you listen to him read, and when you look at his work, he actually measures. Right, he has these spaces in his poems, and he has deliberately measured that space, and he counts that space when he reads, and so he has a measured silence. Um, uh, yes, John, that's the link to it, right? And so Orlando has these measured silences in his poems, right? And in his reading copy, right, right he specifically times right how long to wait, right? Um, right, and so when we talk about the absence of sound, right, we can actually absolutely talk about silence, right? Right, looking up, right, like what is the caesura, right? How can we use the caesura? Um, which is a silence by which we right the silence by which we organize language, um, that we usually know as punctuation, right? But there are some silences that we use in sentences that are not punctuated, right? um, and 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 natural silences, right? Not like um, the silences that like Kirk will use, right? Um, right, the sort of artificial silences, right? But they're actual, right? These silences that we use that are not punctuated, right? But all punctuation will absolutely functions on using the caesura, except for like apostrophes and things like that, right? Um, yeah, and that's part of right, and by controlling right, we're going to limit ourselves to these sounds, right? Right, we're absolutely leaving sounds out, right? By picking the sounds that we use and picking the sounds that we don't use. Um, it is very Latin. Yeah, yeah. I put an extra e at the end. Andrew is correct. Um, yeah. Um, yeah. So it's this really cool, this really cool stuff we can do with sound, right? And one of the great ways that we can do this, if you have access to multiple languages, right? Being able to um, right layer in those right connect to those languages through sonics, right? In addition to sense, right? What the content of those words means, in addition to right the sounds of those words, right? And looking up, right? Right, and that's right. You can get into right some of the really technical stuff with it, right? Looking up what phonemes and learning um, the phonetic alphabet, right? Which is a very different than like right the alphabet we use in English, right? Um, and you get into languages that have sounds that English doesn't have, right? Um, English has only, depending on the dialect, English averages out at about 45 phonemes. It's about what we use. Um, and you'll get and there are words that and there are sounds that we don't have um, at all. Right, you get into some of these indigenous languages, um, right? Even when you get into like Japanese has some sounds that we just do not have, right? In English, right? right, like specifically, right, like that TS sound in, right, we're used to pronouncing tsunami, right, with the T is silent, right, but in Japanese, right, it's not silent, right, that T is in front of there for absolutely for a reason, right, but we don't have necessarily words that have the ts sound, right, right, that tsunami, right, we just cut the right, we just cut the T out altogether, right. Um, but we still have some similarities, right? There's still some phonemes that we will share, right? And working those and blending those in together, right, so that it helps, right? Um, we can keep those things together in that way.
Michaelson,
Andrew,
I was gonna kind of talk a little bit about something if I can for a second.
I'll go for it.
So one thing that's super interesting because I love linguistics is thinking about how we say words too. Because if you think like when you say like this guy Olson, like in some words we add a little bit of at the end of the words, even if we don't think about it. We do like I'm trying to think of one that's working. Uh, so like thank is you hear the thank there's like an at this end of at the end of it. So thinking of those types of sounds as well, the ones that we don't see but that we hear. And
Right.
then also just because I'm a super nerd, there's like the words um D and G and T all sound very similar. And like T is not voiced, but
Yeah.
D is
Yeah.
voiced.
P as well.
Yeah, P and
Yeah.
D, G, and all those kinds of different ones are
Yeah.
fascinating to think about as well.
And annoying to me when I have to make reservations, right? If you look at my last name, right, I've got two P's in a row. Um, and I would get, oh, Mr. Nat, Mr. Knapp, Mr. Nad, like, no, no, it's not, it, P is in, and I tried to like P is in Paul. Well, it could be T is in tall or B is in ball, right? Right. So I generally try to go with like some, like P is in poison, right? Um, but absolutely right. We absolutely want to consider, right? And that's part of what helps us make these poems our poems, right? Individual to us, right? The way that where that we say words and the way that words sound to us, right? Right. With right with regional specific, right? And sometimes, right, depending on where we are, we'll change the way that we say words, right? Right. I start hanging out with a bunch of my native friends, right? Even the tone of my voice will start to change, right? As I start to sort of mirror them a little bit, right? I start talking more like this, eh? Yeah. I start, right? My sounds start to drag out a little more. You know? And so it depends, right? Where are you from, right? How do you talk, right? Let the way you talk, right? Honor that, own that, right? I'm gonna get a little too native in there. Right, right, but right, the way that right you right own these things, right? Right, there's some of these ideas that I very much disagree with, right? That there's hierarchies in different dialects of English, right? Be as native as I need to be. Right? That there are these hierarchies, right? And I say this as somebody who teaches right freshman composition and right, um, right, and right, you have to have right grammatically correct sentences and all of that, right? Like, but trying to get into right, like this is just right, like it's BS, but it's the way that you will be considered better considered in various fields to use this specific dialect of English right? And it's a highly formal. It's just right. That's just what we call it, is highly formal, right? That doesn't necessarily make it more useful, right? It's very much when we talk about, right, colonization and things like that, right? We look at the base and the superstructure, right? Um, right. The superstructure enforces its culture onto the base, right? And so when we, right, and and the culture of the superstructure is such that we must use, right, that's what's decided, that we use, right, highly formal English, right? And that's what, you use in resumes, and that's what you use in essays, right? um, because that's their language, right? It's not, right, that's their dialect, right? And that's all it is a dialect, right? um, which is not to say that one dialect, again, it, there shouldn't be a hierarchy, right? There is, right, in all practical purposes, right? um, but for the purposes of poetry, there's no hierarchy, right? They're just different dialects, right? And use the dialects that you have access to, right? Use the dialects you want, right? You have access to all of this language. Don't let anybody tell you that there's language, right? I mean, there's obviously, right, like incredibly hurtful language, and uh, right, that, there's sometimes poetic call for, right? If that's language that you own, right? Um, but right, um, and I think of that for various ethnicities, right? My own, right? Um, right, the Washington team, right, has finally changed, right, has finally agreed to change its name. Um, CNN just called us something else, which has been just beautiful memes all over
I saw
the
that,
native.
Michaelson. My
Also,
friend texted it to me, and I was like, "That's offensive because something refers to a thing, not people." So I'm just sitting here going, like, "Good Lord, what the hell?"
yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Oh, it has been the all over the indigenous internet. Just memes, just making fun of it. We're strong, resilient, at something else. Just two states times. Yeah, absolutely, right. Absolutely different states. You could look at like different neighborhoods, right? Right. Uh, England finds this fascinating, right? The different regionalities, right? We absolutely have this, right? Like you look, right, East Coast, because it's been settled for longer in English, has more variation in its dialects, right? And then as you get further and further out west, right? Um, you don't see that as much in English, right? You'll see that in more so in like in Spanish, right? Because right, Spanish colonization has been here for quite some time, right? Right, New Mexico um, had the governor of New Mexico at one time was investigated by the Spanish Inquisition, right? That's how long, right? Um, right, Spanish colonization has been um, in, right, the United States, and where we can see some of that, right? Um, right, but we'll, yeah. um, so you see it regionally, right? You see it all in all kinds of ways, right? In terms of, right, jobs, right? Right, vocationally, right? If you start paying attention to the way people sound, right? Um, and the way people sound when they're at work, when they're not at work, right? There's absolutely, right, uh, right, the retail voice, right? If you've ever had to work retail, um, I'm fifth generation from LA, but sometimes speak like my father who grew up in Kansas. Yeah. Um, yeah, my father-in-law uses in the Midwest and up in Michigan, right? They'll put the R in words that have no business having it, right? Right, going to the car wash, right? Yeah, wash, yeah. Um, yeah, he's gonna wash the dishes, yeah. And he's lived in California his whole life, but his mom. Yes, hello. There's another cat who needs attention. His name is Sir. He's about a year and a half old. He's a bud. Okay. He's hiding. He's decided he's gonna hide under the table and hang out by my feet. That's where he's gonna. Otherwise, I'd pick him up and show him off. Yeah, there's so much in Spanish. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of right, and right, there's a lot of right. We talk about all of these different sounds, right? All these different words that we use, right? Um, from different areas, right? Um, and they're all fantastic, right? They're all wonderful, and we should right use what is right. Use what's ours, right? Right where we grew up, right? Um, right. We have ownership over our ancestry, right? Where did we grow up, right? Where did our parents grow up, right? Um, and, you some of us are old enough to have been in school when they tried to beat that out of us, right? You have to talk this way, right? And right, and we don't have to do that anymore, right? Right. What are good ways to hear poems like these and read along with them? Um, so finding poems um, that are read, right? There's a lot of them online. There's certainly a ton of um, spoken word that's online, right? Um, and then spoken word is one of these places in poetry where um, there's certainly um, a stereotyped cadence within spoken word, um, but that's not the only cadence, right? But you can still right there's still very much right in spoken word that ownership of the sound that the self has, right? But you can also see it if you can find people who online, people like David Crystal and his son who um, helped revive um, the old pronunciation of Shakespeare, right? Um, you find there are all of these, right? They found all of these puns that were otherwise not available in the way that we pronounce um, English today as when it was pronounced sort of during his time, and how they and you can find videos of them talking about how they um, figured out what they call it OP, old pronunciation or original pronunciation, um, how they came about that, and then using how they were able to uncover this sort of this dialect that's sort of no longer spoken, right? How they were able to bring that back, right? And to the point where there are some performances of Shakespeare that they're behind um, at the Globe that were done in original pronunciation, um, where the run times are have a somewhat significant difference, right? Yeah, right. And our voices will change over time, absolutely, right? As we grow up, right? Right, depending on where we spend our time and how we spend our time and what we spend our time doing, right? Um, Yeah, right. This is part of right, part of what we can, right, some more of the things that we can get from hearing poets read their own work, right. Right, as we can, right, we start to be able to hear some of this soundscape and this sound quality, right, and it um plays into a little bit about how we choose to read our poems, right. That we do so um with a degree of intentionality, right, that we do so on purpose, right. And there can be some times, right, where instead of not necessarily, right, where a poem is not um, necessarily read, right, but is performed, right, where we put on a persona, right, and sort of try to embody the poem a little bit more, right, where it becomes so much more, um, right, as opposed to, right, just reading it, right, um, right, that we do more with it, right. Um, Yes, the oral, yeah, I mean, it's right. So the English tradition of poetry absolutely comes from song, right? Um, and I have opinions about oral, like, right, oral tradition as it relates to in native ways, but I'll talk about that. I think in 2 weeks, 1 week. I don't remember. I know I know what I'm doing today, and I know what I'm doing tomorrow, and I have a sense of what I'm doing in the future. But I'm just trying to keep it day to day, man. Just trying to live each day at a time. Yes, it's hard out there. That's all I'm saying.
Well, you'll be coming here to tell us about what books to read in a week.
In a week, yes, I'll be here in a week, talking about uh, native poetry. And I'm gonna I'll talk about some anthologies and stuff that aren't just poetry of people indigenous to the United States and Canada, right? But to help us get um, looking at some good native poetry that's indigenous poetry from outside of the states, outside of the Western Hemisphere, even. So
That's great.
have your Christmas money ready.
Do you have just so we can get ready for it? Do you have bookstores that we should be shopping from? Maybe indigenous bookstores, that kind of thing.
Um, yes, um, there's a native comic book store in um, oh, it's either in Albuquerque or it's in New Mexico. Um, that um, George R. R. Martin helps out a lot with. So I think it's got to be in Santa Fe. Um,
I think I have the link
he's
right
been a
here.
really he's been a really great, as this is part of the world that I pay attention to largely is the indigenous world. So I don't know, there's a lot of authors out there who in their personal lives are not really great people, um, and and I don't know all of them. So if people know things I don't know, I'm happy to. I mean, happy is a strong word, um, but I welcome that knowledge. But as far as I know, this is one of the good things that George R. R. Martin has done. Is this work in Santa Fe and this work with IIA and with Indigenous people out there. I mean, I also know he drives like a friggin' maniac. He's almost driven over a few of my friends in his stupid purple Tesla. Just how you know it's him, because he's the only person in Santa Fe with a purple Tesla. Um, but he owns like a movie theater and stuff like that. So he helps. He helped get that comic book store funded and going. Um, and I'm gonna get some of those names and things for us. Um, but it's sort of in terms of like regionality where there are strong indigenous presence, right? Looking at right eastern Arizona, um, large parts of New Mexico, right? In terms of right, there's a huge, really strong native population there. I mean, California has more native people in it than any other state, just per capita by the numbers. But you wouldn't know that by looking at our state when you compare it to say Arizona, New Mexico, right, Washington, Northern Oregon, right? If you've ever been to any of those places, right, you see this right, strong, right, native presence, their murals and things like that, which just speaks to right how, in terms of right how progressive we imagine California as opposed to right the things that we work really hard to erase and to keep erasing, right? Um, right. As you look in these other places that have much smaller populations, right, but much stronger presence, right? Um, to the point where, right, like you can, right, when you look at, right, right, where New Mexico, right, where New Mexico went blue this year, and then you look at where the reservations are, right, it's almost an exact overlay, right? Um, so, right, so if you're looking for right, bookstores around those areas, right, um, right, there are places in right up in the New York area, right, that have a strong, right, parts of Alaska, right, have these, right, strong, tight communities. Minneapolis, of course, right, it's where the American Indian movement starts, right? Um, so, um, yes, yeah, you're here on Tongva land. Yeah, I'm up here in Serrano land, up in right, what we now know as the San Bernardino Mountains, right? The San Bernardino National Forest, right? Which is right, indigenously, right, none of those things. It's a forest, right? And it's not, does not belong to San Bernardino, does not belong to the nation, right? This guy is part of Coast Salish. I love Coast Salish. I love that area. Just but I mean, right, I'm Ohlone, right, so, which is uh from San Francisco down to Carmel. So that's absolutely uh my uh temperature and uh whatnot. Um, so I love being up here in the mountains with some of these trees, but it's just it's frankly not enough and not the right kind that I'm where I feel more at home. But people from California keep moving up to Oregon and Washington and pissing them folks off. They keep raising their rates for insurance and all of that. No, but I would love to live up there. Love to live. It's still a strong uh, canoe people. Right? They hate us in Oregon. They do. They do. But get over it.
Actually, that's a lie. They hate us everywhere.
Wow.
New
Yeah.
Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, anywhere Californians go, they get mad at us.
Yeah. That's yeah. Like New York and Hawaii are like the only places that it's more expensive to live. But we're also raising their property values, so they're welcome. Papa Rennie on Washingtonians on California. I guess. Oh, I bet you do. I bet. I bet. Especially up in Woodby. Woodby is such a fascinating island politically in terms of right, American politics, especially like where it is, like where it is, like just very. You wouldn't think, but yeah. I have cousins who work for the base over there. One of my cousins is now a mail carrier. He finally got a job over there, so which is one of the hard parts about Whitby and in any area that's sort of a resort town, right? It's just so hard to keep your for kids to have stuff to do, right? Right, and right, it's just a similar problem in right, some of these beautiful areas where right, where we have reserves and things like that. Right? It's hard to keep kids occupied with good stuff, and so they get bored and they find things to do. That's what kids are going to do, right? And it can go sideways, unfortunately.
Okay.
Well, we're getting to about 2:30 here. So is there any sort of last last questions I can help address in terms of sound stuff and what we're talking about today? Yeah, play with sounds, play with words and sounds. It's yeah. Try putting making multiple poems, right, out of the same groups of sounds, right? Putting poems together that way, and then read those, right, collecting, right, and organizing those poems, right, based on right the trajectory of the sound, right, not just right stepping outside of the individual poem, right, and thinking about right how we collect things, right, how we move through them, right, looking at that play in such a much broader context, right? And in right those tight contexts, right? Looking at right like word to word, right? Those decisions, and then right this broader. When are we working on our sound masterpieces? Well, I'll have my people talk to your people, Drew. Well, thank you all so much for being here.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michaelson.
You're welcome.